Hello, and welcome back. Today we are diving into the second insight of the Celestine Prophecy, and this is a doozy. This is a really big one that I would say is a key foundation of a lot of the work that I do in my own life and with clients and students inside my programs, because it's looking very deeply at where the programming stems from. And anyone who's been in my world for a while, you probably have already gotten the sense of how maybe even fixated I am on programming, right? And like why we think the way that we do. And that's individual. So whether that's based on culture, religion, gender, upbringing, the place we grew up, the beliefs our parents had, like all these different things influence our programming. And when I first started my own healing work and started looking at like limiting beliefs, it probably started there first. Realizing the beliefs I had from both of my parents and being like, this is what my mom thinks, not necessarily the ultimate truth, right? Or this is what my dad thinks, not necessarily the ultimate truth. This is what I observed in my childhood and what I made it mean, but it isn't necessarily the ultimate truth. And it started at that point where I became more consciously aware of how everything was just a program playing out unconsciously. And it's when we start to become conscious of these things that we can make changes, we can break the program, break the pattern, and therefore create an entirely different reality. Most people who are unsatisfied are living in a program that wasn't meant for them. They're living in a program that is outdated and came from all those different potential influences that I mentioned at the beginning. So when we start to have a better understanding of how, our parents' beliefs impact us in the present moment, and then when we take it one step further, because what might happen at the beginning is, for myself, for a lot of my students, we feel this way, where I first became a little bit angry at my parents because I was like, you did this thing or you said this thing, and it caused me years of doubting myself or hating my reflection or silencing and feeling like my voice didn't matter, or like all these traumas that ended up playing out. And they were kind of a root cause of where that belief or that first imprint started. And initially I felt very angry and my victimhood blamed them. But when we can once again take a more healed and higher perspective approach, higher self approach, we can realize, well, why did they think that was normal, right? Why was that their belief? And in deep healing work and open conscious communication with my parents, then I could start to sit and go, why did you believe this thing? Where did that stem from for you? And then they could share, well, these were the things I experienced in my upbringing, or what my parents taught me, or what society had normalized, what they said was good or bad, or how I had to fall in line. And so this was just my normal. And I passed it on to you without even realizing, right? And this is how intergenerational trauma continues. This is also how, changes maybe get slowed down because of the programming. So I get very passionate and very fired up because I dive deep into these rabbit holes and look at, where did the programming start even before that? Why was this being pushed upon society? Why were certain things being normalized? Who benefited from that agenda? Who was, funding it or pushing it? That's why I'm not behind the feminism agenda, because you look at who is funding that and what their purpose was and what they were trying to do. It's actually not about women's equality or women's empowerment whatsoever. But I digress, and I will not go into that. But all of the programming starts from somewhere. And unfortunately, we live on a planet that has been deeply programmed for an incredibly long time, which is a very long-winded intro of saying, welcome to the second insight, because the second insight is all about looking at the greater historical approach and why human beings are where they are right now, why we think the way we think right now, and why the spiritual awakening that is the first insight is happening. So if you haven't watched the first insight, or you haven't listened to this, if you're just listening to the audio version on the podcast, go back. I highly recommend listening to insight number 1 from the Celestine Prophecy first, because insight number 2 is a really beautiful way of anchoring it in and understanding why we maybe dismiss synchronicities. So you get this magical alignment, this thing that just falls into place or is so perfectly timed that it cannot be coincidence, and yet you end up dismissing it. Or you maybe celebrate it for a moment and then it's kind of gone, and you're back in your hustle and grind, you're back in your mind, your ego stories, your anxiety, your stress, your 3D world. And the reason a lot of this happens has to do with insight number 2. So for me, with like the history and the backstory of programming, I love this insight because it gives us that higher perspective around why humanity is so fucking brainwashed, and, excuse my language, why we got here. Why had we forgotten the truth of who we are? Why is like spiritual or energetic things like labeled as new age or frowned upon or judged in certain ways? Why are religions looked at in a certain way, right? Every single person, and I'm not saying what's right or wrong, that's not the point of any of this. Every single person has their own beliefs though, and their own conditions and connections to these things. So I could say spirituality, or I could say energy, and every single person watching this is going to have different connotations to that. Some might be good, some might be bad, some might be neutral, some might be indifferent, some might not care at all, right? There's no right or wrong to what that word means for you, but it's really interesting when we realize like why humanity became so disconnected from a higher power, from source, from the energetic connection that we all carry, that we're all a part of, and it's a part of us, right? So in this insight, I totally blanked on the word. In this insight, this guy who's explaining it is saying, let me take you back through the last 1,000 years in a quick overview. And I'm going to do my best to summarize what he's saying so that I'm not just like reading all of it. Go read the book, get the audiobook if you want the exact words. But it's a really cool perspective shift that opens you up to like, oh, this is why our society believes these certain things. This is why my parents believe these certain things. This is why generations before that. And again, this book doesn't necessarily touch on who was actually controlling the narrative, which is my rabbit holes that I will save for another day. You are welcome to go into those rabbit holes yourself. It's quite interesting. And it'll change your perspective on why the world is the way that it is, because there's a lot of manipulation and control to benefit certain people by having us just believe one narrative and have us just follow this path. But in the book, they are explaining, so imagine at the beginning of like the year 1000, right? What we call the Middle Ages. At this time, reality was defined by the powerful churchmen of the Christian church, and these men hold a great influence over the minds of the populace. So at this time, people looked to the priests or the churchmen as the most important people. People believed that they had to go through the priest to connect with God, right? These men were kind of idolized as the channel or the only one who could connect to God. And you would go to them and then they would tell you if you've been good enough, if you've been bad, if you're sinning, if you're a saint, right? If you're following in the lines of God, or if you are falling into Satan. They kind of held the power because they were positioned as though they were the only ones who could connect to God. And you can fill that in with whatever word but source, right? Even religious pieces aside. But it was a very religious time where the Christian church was controlling a lot of things. So he's saying, whether you were a peasant or an aristocrat, no matter like what your class was, you looked to the churchmen to determine if you were a sinner or if you were a saint, right? And the churchmen explained that mankind is at the center of his universe, surrounded by the entire cosmos for one solitary purpose: to win or lose salvation. In this trial, you must correctly choose between two opposing forces, the force of God and the lurking temptations of the devil. But you don't have to face this contest alone. In fact, this is what I love. In fact, as a mere individual, you aren't qualified to determine your status in this regard. This is the province of the churchmen. They are there to interpret the scriptures and to tell you every step of the way whether you are in accordance with God or whether you're being duped by Satan. But if you follow these churchmen's instructions, you are assured that a rewarding afterlife will follow. But if you fail to do what they say, if you fail to follow them, they are reading the scriptures and interpreting and then telling you if you are in line or not. If you fail to heed the course they prescribe, then there is excommunication and certain damnation. So picture that, again, 1,000 years ago isn't even that long ago in terms of how many generations and stuff and how deeply that influenced us. But imagine that the beliefs that were so deeply ingrained at that time were that the extremes with God and the devil, heaven and hell, but B, and more importantly than that, is the fact that you couldn't go directly to God to feel a connection and trust, that connection, trust the insights or guidance and the feeling of what was right and what was wrong. You had to go to another mortal. You had to go to a mere mortal and get them to tell you whether or not you were good or bad. So it's already a state of looking to the authority, and the authority in the church as if they have all the answers, and essentially they are kind of playing God because they're telling you whether you're good enough or whether you're bad, right? So your beliefs are that you are kind of underneath them and they get to determine whether you're enough or not. And the next part it talks about is just the fact that you kind of believe everything is defined as the will of God or the malice of the devil. So if crops don't make it, if there's a natural disaster, if something happens, if you lose a family member, a loved one, it's like blamed on one of those two things, right? Depending on how you see it in the beliefs or what the churchmen tell you. And you think like, oh, the reason the crops didn't grow is because like the devil cursed this land, or that family weren't in accordance with God's law, and so their crops were, punished or like ruined, right? To punish them. So there's all these stories around that, okay? But then he goes into, say about 14th and 15th centuries, you start to notice that the churchmen aren't actually as good as they say they are. And a lot of them have discrepancies. A lot of them are not practicing what they preach. A lot of them are doing really inappropriate things that they shouldn't be doing if they are working directly as the hand of God. Whether that has to do with money and corruption and being paid off by certain things to, I'll just read it instead of making my own. You notice certain improprieties on the part of the churchmen themselves, secretly violating their vows of chastity, for example, or taking gratuities to look the other way when government officials violate scriptural laws. These improprieties alarm you because these churchmen hold themselves to be the only connection between yourself and God. So remember, they are the only interpreters of the scriptures, the sole arbitrators of your salvation. So you've spent, at that point, 400 or 500 years where it's been so deeply programmed in you that these churchmen are the go-to, kind of the end-all be-all in determining what's good and bad and determining your fate. You go to them to confess your sins, you go to them for salvation and like purification when you've done something wrong, and yet all of a sudden you realize that a lot of them actually haven't been living by the scripture themselves. A lot of them have actually been doing things that are harmful or, not holy, right? So suddenly there's all this confusion because these are the people you've looked to and trusted and believed in and kind of, followed for all this time, and you realize that something isn't right here. So this started an outright rebellion. People started to demand the churchmen's reign end over the people, and they started to say that each person should have access to the scriptures personally so that we can interpret them as they wish with no middlemen. And the churchmen begin to lose, and all of a sudden these men who have defined reality before your eyes, they are losing credibility. And at this point, the whole world is being thrown into question, and the whole consensus about the nature of the universe and about humankind's purpose here, based as it was on the churchman's description, is collapsing, leaving you and all the other humans in Western culture in a very precarious place. So I would say it's kind of no different than like what we're going through right now in another awakening stage where, let's just say that people have blindly followed the governments for quite some time and followed the doctors, followed the politicians, followed those with a degree blindly, and just been like, they know everything. And like we treat, I know a lot of people who treat doctors like they're God, and like the medical system like it's God. It's like, it's run by money. It's big pharma. It's not about actually, like, some people are well-intentioned, but a lot of it is very corrupt and very evil, and it's where money goes, right? Money talks. Same with the governments, though, and we're starting to see, thankfully, once again, another uprising of people realizing that a lot of the people we've been taught to look to as authority, as the end-all be-all, as the determiners of what is right and wrong or good and evil, they are very corrupt. And so I know for myself, like years ago, it was like pretty shocking to start to go like, what the heck? This is like evil, the things that they're doing. And so many people still think it's normal and okay. And I can imagine that that's probably how people felt back in the 1500s when they started to first see that these saints and preachers and priests and holy churchmen that were supposed to be the direct channel to God and the divine embodiment of God and what is right and pure and good in the world were actually doing really dark and evil and sinister things. And all of a sudden your whole concept of reality is shaken because you're like, this doesn't make sense. This isn't in alignment. And so what do I believe now? Because this was my whole concept of reality for my whole life. And this is why understanding the history, this is why this is the second insight, because when you understand the history of things, you can actually realize, like, there's a reason there's another awakening happening. There's a reason there's more people starting to look at the world differently, because they're having these moments of going, something's fishy about how things are currently operating, and it doesn't make sense. So like maybe I am open to like seeing things differently. I am open to asking questions instead of just blindly following the leader, the so-called leader, right? So as the churchmen start to lose some of their power, people gain some power back by having access to scriptures, being able to read and interpret on their own, start to determine their own concept of right and wrong, which also leaves a lot of fluidity, right? Because every single person's life experiences is going to shape their perception. So they might think they're living in accordance with the Bible, and someone else might say, no, you're not, but perception creates reality. That's not a point of this argument or this insight. What begins to happen, though, is that astronomers, by the 1600s, astronomers had proved beyond a doubt that the sun and stars did not revolve around the earth as maintained by the church. Clearly, the earth was only one small planet orbiting a minor sun in a galaxy that contained billions of such stars. So this gentleman in this part of the book says, mankind has lost its place at the center of God's universe. See the effect that this had. So now when you watch the weather or plants growing or someone suddenly die, what you feel is an anxious bafflement. In the past, you might have said God was responsible or the devil, but as the medieval worldview breaks down, that certainly goes with it. All the things you took for granted now need new definition, especially the nature of God and your relationship to God. So imagine spending all this time believing that the earth is the center of God's universe, and then suddenly that's proven not to be true. And all of a sudden, all these things that you once would blame or kind of justify or give credit of like, oh, it was God's doing, or oh, that was the devil involved here, suddenly that kind of loses its grip as well. And then now you're just like, I don't even know. Like, I don't even know where I stand or what to believe in. So with this awareness, the modern age begins. And there's a growing democratic spirit and a mass distrust of royal authority. What it starts to go into here is now we start to question the reality that the churchmen had given us, and then they started pushing towards the creation of a new mandate for science. So people looked at, we need a way to study. We need a method of consensus building, a way to systemically explore this new world of ours, because there's so much beyond what meets the eye. There's so much that we have maybe been lied to or deceived about. We want to understand it, so let's start studying it. Let's start searching. Let's start seeking for more answers or understanding. Let's learn about it firsthand through trial and error, through testing, through studies, through observation, and create a concrete new belief system based upon that. So understanding, testing an idea about how the universe works, arriving afterward at some conclusion, and then offering this conclusion to others to see if they disagree or to see if they agree, right? Like, that's hypothesizing in scientific study. And so he said, you would have prepared explorers to go out into this new universe, each armed with the scientific method, and you would have given them their historic mission. Explore this place and find out how it works and what it means that we find ourselves alive here. You knew you had lost your certainty about a God-ruled universe, and because of that, your certainty about the nature of God himself. But you felt you had a method, a consensus-building process through which you could discover the nature of everything around you, including God and including the true purpose of mankind's existence on the planet. So you sent these explorers out to find the true nature of your situation and to report back. That was a lot of reading. So we went from blindly trusting the authority and the churchmen, who not all were bad, I'm not going to paint that, right? But probably a good chunk started to deviate, to then trying to find science, trying to find true proof, tangible evidence, physical evidence. And this is what makes things with the energetic realm so challenging. And even for myself, I'm an incredibly logical person, so I love being able to logically understand with like proven science how the subconscious mind works, or how the brain is operating, or how trauma is stored, or how we can, heal, how the placebo effect influences things. I also love the understanding and like tangible evidence of like energetic frequency and how this healing works, and quantum physics, so that I'm not just like some random person out there being like quantum healing, woo woo, and like I want to understand it in order to believe in it. But a lot of this is the transition that the world went into, where we kind of stopped trusting that feeling, or trusting that deep inner knowing, trusting our own channel to source. Because at that time, they'd never experienced being a channel to source. They'd only experienced it through someone else. They'd only experienced it through another person. And then they started to look for tangible physical evidence through science. And so we started to idolize science and idolize the proof. And they all have a place. It's obviously really important that we could study these things. But what's really interesting in how this insight ends is that the manuscript, he says that at this point we began the preoccupation from which we are awakening now. We sent these explorers out to bring back a complete explanation of our existence, but because of the complexity of the universe, they weren't able to return right away. What was the preoccupation, he asked? Put yourself in that time period again, when the scientific method couldn't bring back a new picture of God and of mankind's purpose on the planet. The lack of certainty and meaning affected Western culture deeply. We needed something else to do until our questions were answered. Eventually, we arrived at what seemed to be a very logical solution. We looked at each other and said, well, since our explorers have not yet returned with our true spiritual situation, why not settle into this new world of ours while we are waiting? We are certainly learning enough to manipulate this new world for our own benefit, so why not work in the meantime to raise our standard of living and our sense of security in the world? And that's what we did. So we shook off the feeling of being lost by taking matters into our own hands, by focusing on conquering the earth and using its resources to better our situation. And only now, as we approach the end of the millennium, can we see what happened. Our focus gradually became a preoccupation. We totally lost ourselves in creating a secular security, an economic security, to replace the spiritual one we had lost. The question of why we were alive, of what was actually going on here spiritually, was slowly pushed aside and repressed altogether. We've forgotten that we still don't know what we're surviving for. So the second insight, history is done now. The second insight is very much the realization that we have been preoccupied. And I will take it as far as to say we've been distracted and brainwashed in a distraction. in terms of building in the 3D and in terms of the ego-driven society that we see a lot of now, because it just never ended, right? We realized we could build things. We realized we could continue to increase our standard of living. That's all beautiful. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. We realized we could expand our knowledge of things. Science did come into play and bring incredible breakthroughs, things that allowed, surgeries or helping people, supporting with quality of life, right? All these things that did grow and did evolve in some beautiful ways. But in the process, humankind has lost its connection to spirituality and to its true nature as one with God. So we've been focusing so much on doing more, hustling more, building more, collecting more, achieving more, all these things in the physical, instead of, but what is the purpose behind doing this? And what does it mean to have more if I feel empty inside, if I feel anxious all the time, if I am not satisfied, if I feel like there's this void and this like hole in my chest because there's got to be more. And it is in the understanding of this history, which I'm not saying any of this history is true. I'm not saying any of the dates are true. I'm not researching the book. That's not the point. Maybe some of the dates are off. I don't even know. I would trust that the author did some, research. I don't know anything about Middle Ages or medieval times or when this stuff took place. So we're not quoting me on that. But we do understand that there's been a major evolution over the last 1,000 years. And depending on what was so prominent and so deeply impactful in each age, that naturally affected where we are today. And so we're at this point now where people are realizing they're lacking purpose, they're lacking meaning. The day-to-day life and hustle and grind is not satisfying, which is why we start to be open to the first insight and start to see things differently, notice synchronicities, realize that emotions and energy matter, right? That doing something from love and like from excitement and alignment feels very different than doing it from obligation and force and I have to. And it makes me think back to when I was really little, like 7 years old or something, and my mom was driving my brother and I. We were driving right near our mall, I think going to one of his hockey games or something, and I just remember asking, like, what's the purpose of life? And my mom was kind of like caught off guard, and she's like, well, you go to school, and then eventually you get a job, and then eventually you get a house and get married, have a family, have kids, and then they go to school, blah, blah, blah. And I just sat there and I was like, I don't want to do it. Like, I was like, then what, And she's like, well, eventually you die and that's it. And like, that bothered me at such a young age because that felt so meaningless. If I'm just here to like go through this system, go through the motions, it didn't feel exciting. It didn't feel worth my time. And I said at that really young age of like, I wouldn't want to be here then. Like, why not just leave right now? There's no need for that. And she was like super shocked and like kind of caught off guard. But I just couldn't understand that, like, that's it, And that's what I would say so much of this collective shift and what this book is about is just the fact that people are realizing that there has to be more. And it's so beautiful. I can say firsthand when you start to open up to that and you start to follow those nudges and believe that there's more, believe that you deserve to be happy, believe that life is meant to be like this incredible, beautiful experience. It's in that process that you open yourself up to the true magic of the universe and what your life experience is supposed to be. When we get out of the box of what we've been told we should do, and we start following what feels good and what your soul is calling you to, and what God ultimately is calling you to. I am a very firm believer that God did not put you here to sit in a job that you hate, cry to and from work every day, be anxious and stressed and burnt out and miserable and numbing or avoiding your problems because life just sucks. You did not incarnate for that. What a waste of a beautiful human life. What a waste of a powerful, magnificent soul. God would not sign you up for that. That's society. That's programming. That's the history, right? And culture or expectations. That is all just programming. And so our job on planet Earth is to decondition that and reprogram that out so we remember who we are. That's my life's work, not only for myself, but for others, is to help you see that you're here for so much more and help you clear out the beliefs, the experiences, the programming that's telling you otherwise so that you can build confidence in your true path and then follow that true north. So this insight is like one of my favorites, although they all are, because at the time of recording this, I think I'm already on the 6th insight because I've been reading this book for a few weeks, but I just hadn't had a chance to record the videos yet, and every single one is really cool. But my nerding out brain about programming just loves this one because, again, regardless if like history and dates are aligned or not, it's still truth in terms of every generation, what they had been taught to believe in, what they had been taught to normalize. And this is obviously only looking at one small aspect in terms of like the Christian church, Christianity, right? I think it was looking at. And so, being able to understand like how these things progressed and why people have the beliefs they have now, it all came from somewhere. And when you realize that and you take that bigger perspective, you can go, you know what? I don't want to subscribe to that anymore. I don't want that to be my normal. I don't want that to be my belief. I don't actually think that's true. I think that came from deep-seated trauma and deep-seated programming, and that programming doesn't serve the world that I want to live in or the world that I'm here to create. So we're gonna get rid of it, and that's the power that you have when you become aware. And so much of this book is about remembering the power of you as a conscious being, you as a fractal of source. And as you remember, you live in a different way, you take different actions, you show up from a way more empowered and aligned place. And that's when the miracles occur. That's when everything works out so beautifully. So please, as always, if you have any thoughts, comments, questions, drop them down below. I would love to hear from you. I forgot to say it, but I have a new Telegram group I just started. If you want to be a part of the community and, maybe do little book clubs in there as well, I drop little downloads and collective updates. There's some incredible humans in there already who share uplifting and supportive tools, podcasts, resources, things that they're going through just so that you don't feel alone in navigating your time here on Earth. The link for the Telegram group is below as well. So many different resources, trainings, hypnosis recordings for you. Dive in, take a look, see what would be most supportive for you at this time. And I will be here again very soon for the 3rd insight as well as all my other videos and podcasts. You can check them out, and I will talk to you soon. So I'm sending lots of love, and yeah, keep stepping into your power.